the Brighton Marine Hospital near the Massachusetts Turnpike. Wallace found it funny that a marine hospital should be nowhere near water. The compound consisted of 7 buildings, 7 moons orbiting a dead planet, as he would describe it in Infinite Jest, all leased to various substance abuse groups. Wallace met Deb Larson, the director, at his new temporary home. Tall and blonde, she walked with a limp. Drunk, she had fallen down in her kitchen, hitting her head. Even then, she hadn't stopped drinking. Wallace liked her at once. She gave him a link to an old life that was still his present. You could almost see Harvard. From the top floor of the building. Recovery facilities tried to control the stress levels of their participants, and one activity they didn't allow was school. I should tell you something about school. Wallace had no choice but to call the philosophy department at Harvard and ask for a leave of absence. He was too humiliated to go back to get the vegetable juicer, a gift from his mother that he had left behind in the graduate office. As a new arrival, Wallace was not allowed out of the building on his own for the first 10 days. For the next 20, he could go out only to substance abuse meetings. The basic idea of these houses, is one, a lot of 12-step meetings, and 2, take you away from the life that's led you to be an alcoholic or an addict of whatever sort. Then he was expected to find low-level work. Wallace, whose only real skill was teaching and writing, cast around and was able, probably thanks to the presence on his resume of the head of the Amherst College Security Department, to get hired as a guard at Lotus Development, a large software company. Does anyone remember Lotus? Lotus 1, 2, 3. I mean, Lotus was the Microsoft of the late 80s, later devoured by, I think, maybe Microsoft. Granada House rules stipulated a 40-hour work week, so Wallace got up at 4:30 in the morning to take the Green Line and worked until 2 p.m., walking a vast disc packaging plant in Leechmere, hawking in his whereabouts every 10 minutes and twirling his baton, or so he later said. One of the sort of challenges and pleasures of writing David's biography is that he lied so consistently. So this letter, did he actually walk? It's very picturesque that David should be walking, twirling his baton like, some officer in a Keystone Cops movie. But he also writes a letter to another friend where he says they basically sat in front of a video monitor watching these video monitors to make sure nobody stole anything. And I mean, late in the research on the biography, I came upon an uncollected story of David's, one that nobody's ever seen, called The Piano in the Pantechnicon. Just a kind of a sketch, and in it, there's a security guard who walks around twirling his baton. This is from before David was at Granada, so I suspect he just liked the details so much he made it his own. He would tear pages out of his notebook and send letters to his friends, maintaining contact with a small group of editors and writers who were vital to him. Give me a little time to get used to no recreational materials and wearing a polyester uniform and living with 4 tattooed ex-cons, and I'll be right as rain, he wrote an editor with ironic brio shortly after starting. Even inside Granada House, he managed to attend to the business of being a writer, following up on submissions to magazines and reading pages of stories he had coming out. He could see the strange side of the situation. When the galleys of Order and Flux in Northampton arrived from Conjunctions magazine, with a page missing, he told the editor he could send it at his convenience. I'm not going anywhere for Xmas, he wrote. But in his heart, he was stunned with what had happened to him. I am, he wrote a professor of his, okay, though very humiliated and confused. He was sharing a barracks-like room with 4 men, one of whom, he wrote his old 12-step sponsor, Rich C., had had a stroke while on cocaine and had a withered right side. Mr. Howard, he told his editor at Norton, everyone here has a tattoo or a criminal record or both. To a friend he reported, most of the guys in the house are inmates on release, and while they're basically decent folk, it's just not a crowd I'm much at home with. Heavy metal music, black t-shirts and Harleys, vivid tattoos, discussion of hard verse soft time, parole boards, gunshot wounds, and Walpole, Massachusetts' toughest prison. And there's a picture that one of his, that somebody from the Granada House gave me, which shows David with 3 other of the men in Granada House. And what's kind of astonishing is, one thing that never occurred to me is, they didn't just sit there all the time. At Granada House, they go on a fishing trip. They chartered a boat and they went fishing. And so there's David, who I think most of us think was a fairly big guy. Like that's one of the things that David was this substantial physical presence. But next to these other 3 guys, he's tiny. I mean, he's just a tiny guy with these massive men on all 3 sides. So you can sense that he really was, at least physically, in a world that was completely unfamiliar with him. Wallace continued at his security job for more than 2 months, and then, unable to bear getting up so early, he quit. He went to work as a front desk attendant at the Mount Auburn Health Club in Watertown. His job was to check members in. He called himself a glorified towel boy. But one day, Michael Ryan, a poet who had received a Whiting Award alongside him 2 years before, came into exercise. Wallace dove below the reception desk and quit that day. Wallace's friends were accustomed to his exaggerations and inventions over the years. They came with his clownish, hyperbolic personality. But when they visited him at the halfway house, they found that what he had said was true. He had stepped through the looking glass. His friend Deborah Spark, a fiction writer, remembers sitting in on a group therapy session with Wallace one day and being amazed to hear someone recount killing someone else while drunk. All the same, Wallace found his place. Order, no matter how far in the context, was always easier for him than the unstructured world outside. He met with a counselor, and nearly every evening he drove to different parts of the city with other Granada House members for substance abuse meetings. That's one of the sort of wonderful moments in Infinite Jest, other meetings that he goes to. His sponsor was named Jimmy, a motorhead from the South Shore, as he called him, to the novelist David Markson, with whom he had begun a correspondence. Wallace read the big book and enjoyed making fun of its cheesy 1930s ad man vocabulary to his friends. Tosspot, Dave Sheen Heels, boiled as an owl. He laughed at them, but he also knew he needed them or he would die. Mark Costello, who visited him at Granada House, remembers. If Wallace found himself in unfamiliar territory, the residents didn't know what to make of him either. One remembers wondering, this guy can go probably to Betty Ford. Why is he here with us welfare babies? No one really cared for his cleverness. He was to them a type they'd seen before, someone who, as Wallace would write in Infinite Jest, tries to erect denial-type fortifications with some kind of intellectualist showing off. Wallace was back in high school trying to figure out his place in the pack. It's a rough crowd, he wrote his old Arizona sponsor, and sometimes I'm scared or feel superior, or both. Yet a piece of him was beginning to adjust to his new situation. He remembered his last failed attempt to get sober and how he was no longer writing, and asked himself what he had to lose. He came to understand that the key this time was modesty. My best thinking got me here was a recovery adage that hit home. He knew it was imperative to abandon the sense of himself as the smartest person in the room, a person too smart to be like one of the people in the room because he was one of the people in the room. I try hard to listen and do what they say, he wrote Rich C. I'm trying to do it easy this time, not get an A+. I just don't have enough gas right now to do anything fast or well. I'm trying to accept this. Not that things came easily. The simple aphorisms of the program seemed ridiculous to him. And if he objected to them, someone inevitably told him to do what was in front of him to do, driving him even crazier. He was astonished to find people talking about a higher power without any evidence beyond their wish that there were one. Remember, he just come up from being a graduate student in philosophy at Harvard. They got down on their knees and said the thankfulness prayer. Wallace tried once at Granada House, he told Costello, but it felt hypocritical. All the same, he admired one of the old-time 12-step members, known in Infinite Jest as the Crocodiles, who said, it's not whether you believe, asshole, it's about getting down on your knees and asking. There were times when he was sure he would start drinking again. I'm scared, he wrote Rich C. I still don't know what's going to happen. He asked his friend for some words of encouragement, and just when he thought he would give up, a letter arrived in which his former sponsor recounted the last time he had been in detox. They gave me Librium, he wrote Wallace, and I threw them over my left shoulder for luck, and I've had good luck ever since. The image, Wallace told his sponsor years later in a letter, was just the good MFA caliber trope I needed. Stunned as he was, Wallace understood from the beginning that his fall from grace was a literary opportunity. He had been hypothesizing before about a nation enthralled to its appetites, and here he was living among its casualties. So in the midst of his misery, he was alive to the new information he was getting. The communal house, he would later write in Infinite Jest, reeks of passing time. It is the humidity of early sobriety, hanging and palpable. Wallace was known for sitting quietly, listening to residents talking for hours about their lives and their addictions. Later, residents would often be surprised to find that though he had heard their stories, they had not heard his. The explanations people gave for their behavior startled him with their simplicity, but their voices, always his way into composition, were unforgettable, and their stories had a clarity his lacked. He used to complain before, when he was a graduate student in Arizona, that no one ever wanted to write his biography because he had never done anything. He would say, you know, his imaginary sentence from his biography was, David Foster Wallace sat in the library, smoked a cigarette, and thought of what to write next. And who would want to write that? This was the sort of access to interior lives a novelist could not get elsewhere. He was finding, as he later told an interviewer, that nobody is as gregarious as someone who has recently stopped using drugs. Wallace and his notebook were a familiar sight in the communal rooms and recovery meetings, trapping little inspirations before they could get away. And within a few months of arriving, Wallace had already drafted a scene centered on one of the most intriguing members of Granada House, Big Craig. Big Craig, Don Gately in the novel, was one of the Granada House supervisors and sometimes the house cook. There's an absolutely wonderful moment in Infinite Jest where Don Gately is sort of ladling out the overcooked food to the various members of Enid House, but he's paradoxically incredibly proud of what he's done. He had first met Wallace when he found the new resident's stuff on his bunk and threw Wallace's bag on the ground. Craig was in his mid-20s, sober and just huge, as Wallace would later write in Infinite Jest, looking less built than poured, with the smooth immovability of an Easter Island statue. And in this picture of these guys out on this boat, I mean, this description is so perfect for what Big Craig looks like. I mean, he looks like he's just been sort of poured out into the perfect mold, sort of like Michelangelo's David, only he's wearing a Harvard sweatshirt, which of course Wallace gave him. So there's clearly a lot of kind of camaraderie in this. David was very gifted at reaching out to people. Craig had grown up on the North Shore and been a burglar and general addict. Friends closed elevator doors on his head for fun when he was a teenager, a detail Wallace would put into Infinite Jest as well. But he turned out not only to come from a different world, but also to be quite sensitive. And it did not take Wallace long to see the possibilities in a lug with an interior life. There was a sort of Dostoevskian gloss to him, the redeemed criminal, and Dostoevsky was on Wallace's mind. He wrote to his college professor, Dale Peterson, shortly after arriving that going from Harvard to here was like House of the Dead, with my weeks in drug treatment composing the staged execution and last-minute reprieve from same. The reprieve he hoped would spur the same creative surge it had in the Russian. So that's David at Granada House, and one of the absolutely astonishing things is how quickly he starts writing. I mean, we're talking about somebody who's completely dropped out of the world he knows, for whom everything is unfamiliar and threatening, but who never, ever drops the notebook. You know, when I wrote the original New Yorker piece, I always had this idea that David, was basically so stunned when he went to Granada House that, he was basically sort of knocked senseless for months or even years. And there are letters from David where he suggests that. There's a wonderful letter he writes to David Markson where he says, I'm so, basically, because he wasn't using any drugs or alcohol, he says, I'm so stunned, I don't even know whether I like what I read. And not like when he wrote, he couldn't even judge what he read. But it turns out there were really two Davids always, and simultaneously while he's trying to figure out what he likes to read, he's sketching. I mean, and some of these early drafts exist. They're at the Ransom Center, where a lot of his archives went in Texas. And, there they are. I mean, they're handwritten on scraps of paper, and you just realize the commitment that David made to writing was so deep and so entire that it never really flags. It was really his tool of survival. I think one reason we all, or many of us, feel so much for David is this kind of belief in words, this idea that if you can just deploy words successfully, you can save yourself. It runs so deep in him. So now we're going to go past the publication of Infinite Jest, where that was 1989, 1990. David, in fact, writes Infinite Jest. It doesn't take him very long, which is astonishing. And half of that book is really filled with Granada House. Half of it, I think, kind of comes from some notes that were existing beforehand, or even drafts that were existing beforehand. And that's the sort of part about Hal Incandenza and the Incandenza family who run a tennis academy. But half really comes out of this experience, and he basically he experiences it and he pours it into these drafts. And what his time at Granada House gives him really is a stance out of which to write. For the first time, David isn't just clever and precocious and under intense pressure to perform. He's somebody with a point of view, and that point of view is that you can save yourself. That in his case it's a 12-step program, but that there's an idea that comes to him for the first time that if you really can identify with others, if you don't see yourself as this sort of solo bravura performer, you're both doing yourself a favor, and I mean you're doing others a favor because you're respecting them, but you're also doing yourself a favor because you're recognizing your place in the human community. Early on, when he writes Boom the System, he writes this wonderful letter to his editor at the time, Jerry Howard, who's mentioned in this passage. And in that section, he says, I'm deeply preoccupied with what it means to be human in a human community. And what's so interesting is I don't think there's really that much evidence of that in the Boom of the System, personally, but there's a lot of evidence of it. I mean, it is the great theme of Infinite Jest, which makes me think, as with many great writers, that the seeds of the mature David, who I think a lot of us think of as being this kind of canonical figure, really were there even earlier. I mean, David as a young man was so obnoxious that one story I heard again and again, when he's a graduate student in Arizona, and this is before the section I read you where he tries to be a graduate student in philosophy. He's an MFA student in Arizona. He used to go up to some of the MFA students and he would sort of challenge them by saying, have you read Derrida? And if they said no, he would say, well, how can you call yourself a writer? Charming.